Valerie Wyndham stood at her kitchen counter, coffee gone cold beside her, staring at two words she couldn't make sense of. Our engagement. Her thumb pressed against the card's edge like she could hold the sentence still, like reading it one more time might finally rearrange it into something that made sense. It didn't. The gold foil caught the kitchen light and spelled out the same truth every time. 6 years in the making. Forever just beginning. Cooper Ashcombe was her fiancé. Had been for 2 years. He'd proposed with a modest ring and a promise. Steady, warm, real. He'd never once mentioned a woman named Hazel Castellan. And yet, here it was, in her own hands, in her own kitchen. She checked the date on the card. 4 days from now. She checked the address. 20 minutes from her front door, the exact storefront Cooper had described 18 months ago, eyes bright with a hunger she'd mistaken for ambition, the same night he'd asked her for the one thing she'd never given anyone before, every dollar her mother had left her. $180,000. Gone into a restaurant she now realized she might not own even a piece of. Here's the question worth sitting with before we go any further. If you've ever trusted someone with everything you had, your money, your future, the life you thought you were building together, only to find out you were never the only one standing in that story, you already know exactly what she's feeling right now. It's not anger yet. It's disbelief, looking for a place to land. If this is your first time here, welcome to Earned Love, where we tell the stories people whisper about but rarely say out loud. And if you've been with us before, you know exactly what kind of night this is about to become. So hit subscribe now, because what Valerie finds in the next 4 days will change how you think about trust for good. Have you ever loved someone so completely that you stopped asking questions? Not because you were naive, but because the love itself felt like proof enough. You stopped checking. You stopped needing evidence. You just believed. That's where Valerie was for 2 years. And it's worth asking yourself honestly, before the rest of this story unfolds, how would you actually know if the person across from you at dinner every night was building a second life on the other side of town? Most people wouldn't. That's not a failure of judgment. That's simply what trust costs. It asks you to stop looking. That's exactly the kind of trust Valerie gave Cooper Ashcombe. Valerie Wyndham was 34, a woman who'd built a careful, disciplined life out of showing up for people, the kind who paid bills early and kept promises late into the night if that's what it took. She wasn't reckless with her heart. She'd waited a long time to give it away, and when Cooper came along, he felt like the reward for that patience. Cooper was warm in the way that made people lean in. A chef by training, a dreamer by nature, the kind of man who could describe a restaurant that didn't exist yet, with such conviction you'd start furnishing it in your head before he finished the sentence. He talked about legacy, about building something that would outlast both of them. He said it like a man with nothing left to prove, never once like a man still hunting for his next source of money. For 2 years, their relationship had the shape of something solid. Sunday mornings, shared bills, a ring, modest but real, slid across a candlelit table with a promise attached to it. She thought she knew the entire architecture of his life, his ambitions, his failures, even his fears. She didn't know there was a second version of him, living somewhere else entirely. This isn't a story about a man who cheated. Cheating would almost be simple compared to what Valerie is about to uncover. This is a story about how far one lie can stretch before it finally runs out of room. How many people it can hold up at once. How many separate truths one man can maintain without ever letting them touch. Stay with this one until the end, because the answers Valerie finds aren't only about Cooper. They're about a woman named Hazel Castellan, who has no idea yet that her own life is about to collide with someone else's, and neither of them will walk away from that collision the way they expect to. 2 years earlier, on a night Valerie still remembered in exact detail, Cooper had taken her to a small restaurant with candlelight and mismatched chairs, the kind of place that felt more like someone's home than a business. He'd ordered wine she couldn't pronounce, and talked, for the better part of an hour, about a dream he said he'd been carrying since culinary school, a restaurant of his own, built from nothing, with his name over the door and hers beside it in every way that mattered. Then he'd reached into his jacket and pulled out a ring. "Marry me," he'd said, "and let's build something real together, not just a marriage, a life we actually made with our own hands." She'd said yes before he finished the sentence. 6 months later came the harder conversation, The one about her mother's inheritance, sitting untouched in an account she'd never quite known what to do with. Cooper hadn't asked for it directly. He'd simply described the storefront he'd found, the location, the numbers, the timeline, until the request arrived on its own, shaped like an opportunity instead of a favor. "It's not a risk, Mari. It's us. It's our future. I just need the capital to get the lease and the permits, and I'll pay every cent back within 3 years. I promise you, this restaurant is going to be ours." She'd signed the transfer with a steady hand, telling herself this wasn't blind faith. It was investment. In him, in them, in a future she could already picture in detail. $180,000, gone in a single afternoon, and for a long time afterward, she hadn't regretted a cent of it. He'd called her his partner in the business, not just his fiancée, and she'd believed that meant something permanent. That belief was still intact this morning when the envelope arrived, wedged between a water bill and a grocery flyer, easy to miss if she hadn't recognized the weight of the paper. Thick, cream-colored, expensive in a way that announced itself before she'd even opened it. Her name wasn't on the front. Neither was Cooper's. Just their address and a gold-embossed seal reading The Gilded Spoon, grand opening. She'd almost thrown it away. Instead, she'd slid a thumbnail under the flap, expecting a marketing card, maybe an early preview for investors. What she found instead had spent the last several minutes rearranging everything she thought she understood about her own life. "You are cordially invited to celebrate the opening of The Gilded Spoon, a labor of love from Cooper Ashcombe and Hazel Castellan. 6 years in the making. Forever just beginning." She'd read it 3 times, and the words still refused to make sense. Cooper didn't know anyone named Hazel Castellan. Or if he did, he'd never once said the name inside this house, at this table, in 2 years of sharing a life together. The date on the card gave her 4 days. 4 days before this woman's name would be spoken aloud in a room full of strangers, celebrating a restaurant built with money Valerie had believed was theirs. 4 days before whatever this was became public, permanent, impossible to undo. She didn't know yet how deep the lie went. She only knew the ground she'd been standing on for 2 years had just shifted beneath her, and there was no way back to solid footing without finding out exactly how far down it went. If you've ever had one piece of paper change everything you thought you knew about your own life, you understand exactly what Valerie felt standing in that kitchen. And if this story is already pulling at something in you, don't scroll past it. Hit that like button right now, because what she does with these 4 days is only the beginning of how deep this goes. Valerie didn't tell Cooper she'd found the invitation. She told herself this was strategy, not fear, that whatever was happening deserved to be understood before it was confronted, because a confrontation without proof was just an argument, and arguments were things Cooper had always known how to win. He had a way of turning her own doubts back on her, gently, until she ended up apologizing for asking the question in the first place. This time, she needed something he couldn't talk his way around, so for 3 days, she paid attention, not with cameras or confrontation, just the kind of quiet, deliberate noticing she'd spent 2 years choosing not to do. His phone buzzed at 11 most nights now, and he'd slip out to the back porch to take the call, voice dropped low, laughing softly at something she couldn't hear through the glass. When she asked, the next morning, who'd called so late, he said it was a supplier having trouble with an invoice. She nodded. She'd nodded at explanations like that for years, never once counting how many there'd been. The trips had changed too. Cooper had always traveled for the restaurant, distributors, equipment, the ordinary logistics of building something from nothing. But somewhere in the last 2 months, the one-night trips had quietly stretched into 2, and she'd never once asked why, because asking had always felt like something a suspicious person did, and she hadn't wanted to be that. She thought back to 6 weeks before the invitation arrived. A night at their own kitchen table, Cooper sliding a folder toward her with a pen resting on top. "Just a formality, Mari," he'd said, barely looking up from his laptop. "So the investment paperwork reflects the actual capital contribution, standard stuff." She'd signed it without reading past the first paragraph, then filed it away without a second thought, the way you file away anything you've already decided to trust. She'd watched her mother read every contract twice her whole life, and it had never once prepared her for what it felt like to love someone enough to stop reading. Now, 3 days into her silence, she dug the folder out and read every line she'd skipped the first time. Most of it was exactly what he'd said. dense language about capital contributions and equity shares. But one clause near the bottom made her stomach tighten in a way she couldn't yet explain. A limited power of attorney, granting Cooper authority over a joint investment account she hadn't even known still existed in her name. She didn't understand yet what it meant. She only understood that a man who loved her the way he claimed to shouldn't need permission buried in a paragraph to move her money without asking first. 3 days of attention had given her no answers, only more questions, each one heavier than the last. The late calls, the extra nights, the folders she'd signed without reading. Individually, they were nothing. The ordinary friction of a busy life, a stressed fiancé building something from the ground up. Together, they were starting to look like the outline of something she wasn't ready to name. On the third night, when Cooper told her he was heading to the restaurant for a final walkthrough before the opening, Valerie did something she'd never once done in 2 years together. She followed him. She parked 2 blocks from the Gilded Spoon, engine off, lights out, and told herself she'd only stay long enough to see if the story he'd given her that morning was true. A final walkthrough, nothing more. Through the storefront glass, half lit by construction lamps, she could see the dining room taking shape. Reclaimed wood, exposed brick, the kind of place that looked expensive in a way that felt effortless. And there, moving through the middle of it, was Cooper. He wasn't alone. The woman beside him had to be Hazel Castellan. Younger than Valerie had expected, though not by much, enough to sting in a way she hated herself for feeling. Dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, sleeves rolled to the elbow, the kind of ease in her posture that came from having built things with her own hands before. She was adjusting a light fixture overhead, while Cooper steadied the ladder beneath her, calling something up that made her laugh. Valerie didn't move, didn't reach for her phone, didn't start the car. She just stayed exactly where she was, taking in a version of her fiancé she barely recognized, relaxed, unguarded, entirely present in a way he hadn't been with her in longer than she wanted to admit. When Hazel climbed down, Cooper caught her at the waist. The kiss that followed wasn't hurried or secretive. It wasn't the kind 2 people share when they're afraid of being caught. It was slow, familiar, ordinary, the kind that belonged to people who had done this 1,000 times before and expected to do it 1,000 times again. Something in Valerie's chest went quiet in a way that frightened her more than tears would have. She kept her eyes on the glass, on the 2 of them moving through a room her inheritance had paid for, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that the man she loved had never once been choosing between 2 futures. He'd simply been living in both of them. 3 days of questions folded down quietly into just one. Not how long has this been happening? Not how much of us was ever real. Just this. Did Hazel know about her? Did the woman on that ladder, laughing at something Cooper said, know a second woman existed, one who'd handed over her mother's inheritance for the exact same promise Hazel was standing inside of right now? Or was she too just another person being quietly used, no more aware of Valerie than Valerie had been of her 4 days ago? Valerie needed to know, not for Cooper's sake, for her own, because if Hazel didn't know, then the 2 of them weren't rivals at all. They were the same story, told twice. Valerie didn't confront Cooper first. She went to Hazel. 2 days later, she walked into the Gilded Spoon during a lull in the pre-opening chaos. Workers on ladders, wine crates stacked by the door, the smell of fresh paint hanging in the air. She asked for Hazel Castellan by name, and when the woman appeared, wiping paint from her hands with a rag, she smiled the open, unguarded smile of someone who had never once imagined this conversation happening. "You must be here about the flowers," Hazel said. "I swear, if the peonies are late again." "I'm not here about flowers," Valerie said. "I'm here about Cooper." Hazel's smile faded into something wary, still confused rather than afraid. "Do you 2 know each other?" "I'm engaged to him," Valerie said. "Have been for 2 years. I gave him $180,000 to open this restaurant." The rag slipped out of Hazel's hand. For a moment, neither woman spoke. The silence stretched long enough that Valerie could hear the workers upstairs, a drill whining somewhere overhead, ordinary sounds continuing in a room where everything had just gone still. "He told me his ex-fiancée put money into the business before we got together," Hazel said quietly. "He said you 2 broke up over a year ago. He said—" She stopped herself, and Valerie watched the confusion on her face give way to something closer to horror as the pieces assembled into a shape neither of them wanted to see. "He told me he paid you back." "He never paid me anything." Hazel sat down hard on an overturned crate, staring at the half-painted mural on the far wall. A coastal town neither of them had ever visited, the kind of scene people paint when they're selling a fantasy instead of a place. "I signed a note for $40,000, she said, "from my father's retirement fund. Cooper said we needed it to cover a gap after your investment came through, that the numbers didn't quite line up, and he didn't want to ask you for more because you'd already given so much." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Valerie. It wasn't one woman's money, it was two. Cooper had used each of them to cover what the other had left behind, weaving a story so seamless that neither had ever had reason to compare notes, until a gold-embossed invitation slipped through a mail slot it was never meant to reach. "He proposed to me 8 months ago," Hazel whispered. "In this room, before there was even a ceiling." "He proposed to me 2 years ago," Valerie said. "In a restaurant, he told me, reminded him of the one he'd build for us someday." They looked at each other, two women who had each spent months believing they were the only truth in Cooper Ashcombe's life, and understood, in the same breath, that they had both been rehearsed lines in a much longer performance. Not rivals, not opposites standing on either side of a betrayal. Just two people who had trusted the same man for entirely different reasons and somehow ended up in the exact same place. Hazel looked down at the rag on the floor like it belonged to someone else's life. 6 years, she said, almost to herself. He said 6 years like it was ours, like it started with me. "Maybe it did," Valerie said. "Maybe I was the one who came after." Neither of them knew yet how far back the truth actually went, or how many other rooms like this one existed in cities neither had ever visited. All they knew was that everything had just shifted beneath both of them at once, and there was no walking back from it separately. If you've ever discovered that the person you trusted most had been living an entirely different life right alongside yours, you understand exactly what these two women are feeling right now. This is usually where most stories turn two women against each other, but this one doesn't, and that's exactly why you need to stay with it. Drop a comment if you've ever had to face a truth you never saw coming, because what Valerie and Hazel choose to do next is the part of the story people won't stop talking about. That evening, Valerie drove to Hazel's apartment, and together, spread across a coffee table stained with takeout containers and half-dried paint, they began piecing together a timeline neither of them could have built alone. Cooper had met Hazel 6 years earlier at a culinary trade show 3 states away, long before Valerie had ever heard his name. They'd dated on and off, breaking up twice over the years that followed. During one of those breaks, Cooper had moved to Valerie's town and met her at a mutual friend's wedding. The same night, Valerie now realized that he'd told her he'd never been engaged before in his life. He'd told Hazel something different. When they'd reconciled a year later, he'd described his relationship with Valerie as complicated, mostly over. A loose end he was gently untangling. Not a fiancé, not someone he was actively building a future with. "He proposed to me with a ring he told me was a family piece," Hazel said, turning her own ring slowly on her finger, studying it like she was seeing it for the first time. "He said it needed to be resized before he could give it to me properly. That's why I didn't wear it those first few months." Valerie felt something cold settle in her chest. "He told me the same thing, about my ring being resized, except mine actually came back." They sat with that for a moment, the arithmetic of it. 2 rings, 2 stories, 2 different seasons of Cooper's attention, and somehow each woman had ended up believing she was the only one wearing something real. The paperwork told the rest. Valerie pulled out the folder she'd signed 6 weeks earlier. The formality Cooper had asked her to initial without much explanation. Reading it again now, under Hazel's kitchen lamp, the picture sharpened with each line. It wasn't just a limited power of attorney. It was authorization for Cooper to move funds out of a joint investment account entirely in her name, without requiring her signature on individual transfers. Bank records, requested the next morning with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, confirmed what the document had only implied. $30,000 had been moved out of Valerie's account and into one belonging to a property holding company, Castellan and Ashcombe Ventures LLC. Hazel's name was listed on the account. So was Cooper's. Valerie's name appeared nowhere. "He used my name to hide moving your money," Hazel said slowly, working out a puzzle she clearly didn't want solved. "So, if you ever looked, it would look like a business partner, not like theft." "And if you ever looked," Valerie said, "it would look like an investment you agreed to, not like money that used to belong to someone else. They went through 6 years of texts Hazel had saved without ever suspecting she'd need them. Old messages where Cooper described a small business loan covering the restaurant's initial costs, a phrase that now sat directly across from bank statements showing the money had come almost entirely from Valerie's inheritance. Later messages described a funding gap Cooper said had appeared out of nowhere, a story that had sent Hazel to her father for the $40,000 neither of them yet understood the full weight of. "He's not choosing between us," Hazel said finally, staring at the papers like they might rearrange themselves into something less devastating. "He never was. He was just using whichever one of us was standing closest to the hole in the budget." Valerie thought of every night Cooper had come home late from the restaurant, his hands smelling of sawdust and someone else's kitchen. She thought of the ring on her own finger, modest compared to the one now sitting on Hazel's hand, and realized that even the size of the rings had been a kind of arithmetic, a measure of how much each woman was worth to him in a given season of his ambition. "There's still something missing," Valerie said slowly, looking at the numbers laid across the table. $220,000 between us isn't enough to explain a place like this. Not the imported fixtures, not that bar. Hazel went very still. "There's a third investor," she said. "Silent Cooper mentioned him once, a long time ago, and never again. I assumed it was a bank." It wasn't a bank. The name surfaced the next afternoon, buried in a filing cabinet at the restaurant that Hazel, now moving with a focused, determined anger, let Valerie search through without hesitation. Leon Castellan, Hazel's father, not a stranger, not a coincidence. The same man whose retirement account had already sent $40,000 into the restaurant now appeared, in black and white, as a formal silent partner for an additional $150,000, money borrowed, according to a note clipped to the contract, against the family home. Hazel's hands trembled as she read it. "My father doesn't use email," she said. "He wouldn't sign something like this without calling me first. He wouldn't risk the house without—" She stopped mid-sentence. Valerie watched the realization land, complete and unforgiving. "The signature," Hazel whispered. "That's not his." It was close. Close enough to pass a bank teller's glance, close enough to pass a notary's signature line. If the notary happened to be a friend Cooper had made somewhere along the 6 years he'd spent moving between cities and half-finished ventures, a friend they would eventually learn, who had notarized 2 other forged documents for 2 other struggling restaurants Cooper had opened and abandoned in 2 other towns, always funded with someone else's money, always accompanied by a promise of repayment that never quite arrived. This was not a man who had stumbled into deception. This was a man who had built an entire career out of it, a pattern reaching back nearly a decade, each restaurant a fresh performance, each fiancé a fresh source of capital, each collapse absorbed by whoever had trusted him least critically. Valerie sat down across from Hazel in the middle of the scattered paperwork, and for the first time since the invitation had arrived in her mailbox, she didn't feel betrayed. She felt something closer to grief, for the version of Cooper she'd believed in, who had never actually existed, and for the 2 women now forced to mourn him together, in the same room, surrounded by proof of exactly how thoroughly they'd both been used. "Why us?" Hazel said finally, not really a question. Why did it have to be 2 women? Why not just take a loan like everyone else? Valerie had wondered the same thing, and the answer, when it came to her, was almost unbearably simple. Because a loan asks questions a person in love never does. If you're wondering how one man managed to keep 3 separate financial lives afloat without any of them noticing, you're not alone. Comment below with the moment you knew, because Valerie and Hazel are about to face Cooper together, and what he says next will tell you everything about who he really is. They confronted him together, 2 nights before the grand opening, in the empty dining room with the coastal mural still drying on the wall. Cooper's face, when he saw them standing side by side, did something Valerie had never seen it do before. It didn't panic. Not right away. It calculated. She watched him run the math behind his eyes, searching for whichever version of the truth might still save him, and for one terrible second she understood that even now, even caught, some part of him was still performing. "I can explain everything," he said. Hazel laughed. Not a happy sound, but not quite broken either. "Something harder than that. You've been explaining everything for 6 years," she said. "We finally compared notes." He tried anger first, accusing them of conspiring against him, of not understanding the pressure he'd carried, the debts from a restaurant that had failed in another city 2 years before either of them had known him, debts he said he'd never mentioned because he hadn't wanted to burden them. Then he tried something closer to the truth. His mother had been in a care facility for 3 years, the kind of place that cost more than either of their salaries combined, and the collapse of his first restaurant had left him drowning in debt he could see no honest way out of. He said it like a confession. He said it like it should have mattered more than it did. "That doesn't explain the rings," Valerie said quietly. "That doesn't explain choosing to love 2 people at once instead of telling either of us the truth and letting us decide whether to help you." Cooper had no answer for that because there wasn't one. Whatever pressure had shaped the first lie, the ones that followed, the second proposal, the forged signature, the invented funding gap, hadn't been survival. They'd been strategy. A man drowning reaches for anything he can find. A man who builds an entire structure to keep 2 women funding him for 6 years has stopped drowning and started running a business built on other people's devotion. "I do love you," he said to Valerie. Then, turning, "I love you too," to Hazel, as if saying it twice made either version truer. "You don't get to say that anymore," Hazel said. "Not to either of us." There was no shouting after that, no dramatic exit, no thrown glass, no final scene worthy of the restaurant's opening night. Just 2 women turning and walking out together, leaving Cooper standing alone under a half-finished ceiling, in a room built almost entirely with money that had never belonged to him. What came after was slower than either woman expected, and far less satisfying than the confrontation had promised to be. There was a lawyer, weeks later, and a fraud investigation into the forged signature that would take the better part of a year to resolve. There was Leon Castellan, arriving at his daughter's apartment with a face gray from more than just his age, learning that the house he'd spent 30 years paying off now carried a debt he'd never agreed to, and Hazel sitting with him at his kitchen table until 3 in the morning, promising him they'd fight it and meaning every word. There was Valerie, meeting with an attorney who explained gently that recovering all $180,000 might not be possible, not quickly, not without a long court process against a man who'd already begun moving what little liquid capital remained. But the property itself, the lease, the fixtures, the half-built dream of the Gilded Spoon, that had real value. And with Hazel's cooperation, with both their names finally on paperwork that told the truth instead of the story Cooper had constructed, there was a path toward reclaiming something. Neither woman wanted the restaurant at first. For months, it felt less like an opportunity and more like a monument to their own foolishness, something neither of them could walk past without feeling the particular shame of having trusted the same man for entirely different reasons and losing to the same lie. But something shifted, slowly, the way grief sometimes does when it's shared instead of carried alone. Hazel was the one who suggested it first, sitting in Valerie's kitchen on a night neither of them had planned to spend together, going through the last of the restaurant's paperwork. "We built this place," Hazel said. "Even if we didn't know we were building it together. The wood is real, the work is real, he's the only thing that was fake. If you've ever had to decide whether to walk away from something painful or fight to make it yours again, this is exactly the choice Valerie and Hazel were facing, and what they chose next is the reason this story has stayed with everyone who's heard it. If it's resonating with you, subscribe now, because the ending is where this story finally earns everything it's been building toward. What followed was 8 more months of legal proceedings, a settlement that returned a portion of what had been taken, and a criminal case against Cooper for the forged documents. That ended not in the dramatic reckoning either woman had once imagined, but in a quiet plea deal and a restitution order he'd likely spend a decade paying off, if he paid it at all. He didn't attend the restaurant's eventual, much-delayed opening. Neither woman invited him, and by then, neither needed to say his name to explain what the place had cost them. The Gilded Spoon opened under new ownership on a spring evening, almost exactly a year after the invitation first arrived in Valerie's mailbox. The name stayed, not out of sentiment, but because changing it would have given Cooper's story more power over the space than it deserved. 2 names appeared instead on a small brass plaque by the door: Wyndham and Castellan, proprietors. Valerie and Hazel weren't friends in the easy way people become friends over shared interests or long history. What they had was something more complicated, and in its own way, more lasting. A bond built entirely out of surviving the same lie from 2 different angles, and choosing in the wreckage of it to build something honest instead. On opening night, Valerie stood behind the reclaimed wood bar her inheritance had paid for, watching the dining room fill with strangers while Hazel moved between the tables, greeting guests with an ease Valerie had once mistaken for a rival's confidence. Near the back, at a corner table, sat Leon, his mortgage still a fight not fully won, but no longer one he faced alone. There was no reconciliation with Cooper. There would likely never be one. Some betrayals don't resolve into forgiveness. They resolve into distance and the slow work of rebuilding without an apology that would only be one more performance if it ever came. The invitation still sat in the bottom drawer of her desk, not thrown away, not framed, just kept, the one piece of paper that had finally told her the truth.